Today I'm going to talk about some of the pots here with different shapes that I make and the different details associated with the different shapes, and also we'll discuss some of the surface treatment that we apply to some of the pots, and also some of the manipulations of the pots as well. This coiled pot was the one that I used in our demonstration video to show how I go about making a coiled pot. It's a simple little round pot, and in this particular image you'll see it in its unfired state. And when it's unfired, the clay is known as greenware. Once it's been fired, it's my biscuit, and then after that it's your glaze. As you can see, I haven't smoothed the pot to an absolutely bland surface, because quite honestly I'm happy to leave some of the texture which results from the coiling process. And this really, as far as I'm concerned, just confirms the fact that it is a handmade pot. For glazing this pot, I think, as this was a demonstration pot, I'll probably just do a straightforward, fairly simple glaze. Still not quite decided as to what. It might be a white crackle glaze. I might put a blue crackle. I might have a sort of mustardy colour. This will just depend on how I feel at the time that I'm glazing. Here I am in front of one of the very largest pots we've made. At this stage, this is just simply the rough carcass which my assistant has helped to do. He does the rolling out of the slab base and pulling on the extruder for the coils, and then puts it together in this very rough, bland way. And it's brilliant. He's brilliant. And then after that, I take over and decide exactly how I want the surface of the pot to be, whether I want it smooth or whether I want it textured, whether I'm going to give it a surface treatment with my signature mud painting, as I call it, whether I include an inner rim, whether I include an outer rim, whether I might put a beading on it. I might decide to make it into a drum pot and put studs. So there's all sorts of opportunities available to me. And then, of course, there's the sole feet that would then also have to be considered. The biggest problem with pots of this size is the sheer weight. Remember, we're working with unfired clay, so there's a moisture content in it, there's a water content in there, which makes the clay so much heavier. And it's one thing to make the pot, that's not the difficult bit. The difficult bit is, once the pot is made, having to flip it over to put the feet on. And that is quite tough. And usually I get the help, the assistance of my wife to do on one side of the board, and I'm on the other side, and between us we will flip it over. Here we have a typical, fairly straightforward, traditional rectangular pot with an inner rim. I've left some of the surface texture on the pot when I made it, and this will to some extent modulate the glaze that goes on top of the pot. The feet are fairly formal. The corners are just off absolutely square. In other words, I've just softened them slightly. There's not a great deal more I can say about the pot, other than the fact is it was an experimental glaze, so don't ask me how I got this effect, because it's probably unrepeatable. Formal pots of this sort are usually used for fairly formal trees. This pot, being a glazed pot, would probably be more suitable for deciduous species and flowering varieties of bonsai than for the kind of conifers such as pines and yews, larches and junipers. Although being a dull grey, bluey grey, you might just get away with it. You may be able to put something like a yew in it, because the leaves have that dark green colour, which could look quite nice with it. Here I have another rectangular pot And this time, as you'll see, the feet go flush with the surface of the pot. This is something that is quite unusual for me, because they become integral with the actual sides of the pot. And you will also notice that I have scalloped the corners. In other words, taken a sort of concave bite out of each corner to soften the corners. I've also done some decoration on the sides of the pots, just giving fairly spontaneous flashes with a sharp tool. And of course, the glaze that I've used here on this pot is my signature, what I call gunmetal red. It's very, very popular, and is particularly suitable for varieties of conifer. Being a fairly formal pot, some of the more formal styles would be appropriate with this particular type of glazed color. The lines are very, very spontaneous. They just quickly cut in with the corner of one of my bonsai shaping tools, a sharp tool, and the little rectangles, not the rectangles, sorry, the tiny little triangular pyramids were something that I saw in a book, which was the Master's Book of Bonsai, and I was very, very impressed by one of the pots in that book. I think it was on page 36, if my memory serves me correctly, and it was a very, very powerful pot, which used this design just to give it a little bit of offset. Again, some of these little marks, I think, are quite helpful in taking away some of the blandness that would often be the case if you had just a plain side. I know an awful lot of the Japanese training pots are made that way, but for me, bonsai we like to think of as an art. Well, my thoughts are that why shouldn't the pot also be an art? So when I create a pot, in the first instance, after the pot is made up from the coils, etc., and I have the final sort of created pot, that in a sense can be likened to a canvas that a painter might use before he paints. And then whatever I apply to that canvas, to that surface, is for me the art. So all of my pots are thought of in this way, and each pot I consider as an art piece in its own right. And whether it's because of the textures that I use, or whether it's because of additional things like studs that I might put on the pot, or mud painting, or the type of glaze, all of these different things are my painting, as it were, on the canvas. Here I have another rectangle, quite a shallow one, with fairly large incised corners. Again, we call these scalloped corners, and I haven't put an inner rim on this pot. I have my usual extruded lozenge shaped feet, and I've got an experimental glaze on this pot, which has come out really, really nicely as far as I'm concerned. It has a terrific antique effect, and has gone down very, very well on Facebook. Not a great deal more I can say about this pot, other than the fact that it would be very ideal for sort of maple type bonsai, whether mountain maples or trident maples. Indeed, almost any variety of deciduous tree would be okay in a pot like this. You could even use it for root over rock examples of bonsai, but I don't think it would be particularly suitable for the conifers. Conifers usually require rather more subdued, slightly more somber colors like the umbers and the Indian reds, burnt sienna and stuff like that, and the dark grays. To achieve the glaze effect that I have on this pot has been fairly complicated because this pot has been fired several times, and each time it's been modified with either a different oxide or a different glaze to give it this special effect. To be honest with you, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to get. It was, as I said earlier, an experimental pot. I was trying out ideas. Fortunately, I know how I did it, so I will be able to some extent, repeat the effect. With these larger scallop corners, it's just the same. In the first place, when you roll out the slab for the base, you cut out those corners on the slab, and then as you apply each coil, you just follow the shape of the base and go around. It's tricky when you're making slab pots, when you're making coiled pots and having to do these slightly rather complicated shapes. It's quite demanding. The process is very exacting, and you have to keep on monitoring all the time, stepping back, looking at it, checking its angles. Sometimes there's the odd wobble here and there, slight differences. Personally, I'm quite happy with that. For me, if it were entirely perfect, it just wouldn't do it for me. I like pots to be to really show that they've been handmade, that there can be faults in them because the making of the pot it is the process, I should say, of the making of the pot can often result in slight differences, slight anomalies occurring here and there. This round pot with a slightly outward and upward flare is quite tricky because when the clay is on the soft side, as sometimes it is, you never really know what the clay is going to be like when you buy the stuff. It can sink down on itself, and it's not always easy to control. These coil pots it's a very long-winded process. You know, when you make a pot on a wheel, you throw it up and you can get the shape up sometimes literally within a minute or two. When you're making slab pots, you roll out the slabs, you cut the shapes, and you put them around, and there again you've got it. When you're making pots in a mold, you again make your slabs, press them on the insides of the molds, and you've got it. When you're making pots from which might be slip cast, you've just got your wet slip, clay slip, which you pour into the mold, leave it there for 20-25 minutes or so, then pour it out again, and you've got the pot. And they're all very, very short, quick, snappy processes. With coiling, it's not the case. With coiling, it's slow, and it does take a lot of time, a lot of care, and a lot of skill to get the desired effect. But as you can see on this particular pot, I've put an outer rim, I've got an inner rim, I've also got a decorated beading on the bottom of the pot, and if you look very carefully, you'll see that I've got my barley sugar twisted feet. Yes, a little bit like pork scratchings. Yes, and the glaze that we've used here again was the good old signature gunmetal red. Always very, very popular. And this pot would be ideally suited for all varieties of conifer, whether it's a sequoia, whether it's a taxodium, whether it's a pine, yew, larch, and also you could get away with a semi-cascade in here as well, although one would probably need a slightly deeper pot. Beading on pots is quite a tricky process. I have in my extruder, I have a special device where I've got a very, very fine needle, which is like a cross whisker across the hole, so that when I extrude the clay, it actually cuts through. So you're getting, instead of a circular coil, you're getting a hemispherical coil. So you've got a flat bit. And then, of course, that is just attached to the base of the pot in the usual sort of way. I would wet the pot base. First of all, I would scratch it to give it a little bit of texture. And then I would wet it with water, nothing else, which is not painted on. It's daubed on carefully. And then the beading we put on top. And then the edges, the top of the beading and the bottom of the beading would be very, very carefully merged in with one of my hole cutting tools. And then I just use the back of a pencil or whatever is suitable to indent into it to get this particular effect. It's as simple as that. I've got another round pot here. This is a typical semi-cascade pot. Well, I say semi-cascade pot. It's a pot for semi-cascade style bonsai. And I've used my white crackle glaze. This is a dolomite glaze. And I've applied one or two oxides on the rim and a little bit around the bottom of the pot to achieve this sort of biscuity drizzle, as I call it. The feet was an innovation that I've been using about the last 12, 18 months for these sort of pots, so that you could actually thread a string or a wire through the holes created in the feet on the inside of each foot, and to be able to tie the pots down to the bench, the display table or whatever the bonsai is placed on. And in this way, it would cement the pot, as it were, to the table and stop it from being blown over or tipped over with snow. Because when you've got semi-cascade bonsai, they stick out on the side of the pot, the actual foliage, etc., the branches come out, and that can create a sort of lopsided effect. Another thing too with these semi-cascade pots, I usually use a slightly thicker profile or radius with the coils I use. This again gives the pot actual physical weight, which really keeps it down firmly on the table, because these semi-cascade trees can so easily be knocked over, blown over. Lovely little crackle effect on this particular pot. Doesn't always happen like this, but there we are. The crackle effect is done by inking. First of all, I should say that after the pot is glazed and it comes out of the kiln, that white is just literally white, okay, with the blush of beigey green on the top and the bottom, quite bland. By applying ink, and the ink that I use is the Sumi ink that the Japanese and Chinese use in their scroll paintings or for calligraphy, and that goes over the whole of the pot, so the whole pot is blackened, and then this is quickly washed off, and what happens is the crackle in the glaze is exposed because the ink will penetrate the crackle, and here you can see the net result. Very effective. It also gives you an instant sort of aging appearance. It makes the pot look that much older, that much more mature. Here I have a fairly deep, again, semi-cascade pot with studs on the top. And also, if you look carefully, you can see a stud on each of the feet. It's probably my favorite all-time pot. I actually love this pot. Unfortunately, I can't get this glaze effect anymore. Don't ask me why. I think it might just be something to do with the batch of oxide that I'm using at the moment, but it's just not possible, which is a shame. But it's quite a large pot. I made this pot specifically for a wild cherry plum semi-cascade tree that I had, which I no longer have. It's just a beautiful pot. If you notice, the feet are again quite different from my usual lozenge shape extruded feet. What I've done here is I've rolled out some clay, which was fairly thick It was about 3/4 of an inch thick. And then I used a sort of biscuit cutter, a round biscuit cutter, to make some circular things. And then I cut those in half. So you've got these sort of semicircular feet, which I then stuck on in the usual sort of way by scratching, applying the water, and doing the usual thing that you've heard me talk about so often. The studs are just tiny little balls of clay, which I've attached to the side of the pot, and then I have a special little device which I've made by using a little bit of copper tubing. It's a 1/2 inch diameter copper tubing, which I've filled with wax, and then I've scraped the wax on the top so that I've got a slight indent, a rounded indent, and then I can use that to push into my little balls of clay to give this effect. And incidentally, before doing that, I always press the former, as we'll call it, the tubular former into a sponge which has been impregnated with oil, in other words, WD-40, and this acts as a resist against the clay, so the clay doesn't actually stick to the shape maker, the former. This round drum pot has got studs all over the surface, purely for visual effect. Again, it's a semi-cascade pot, glazed in my gunmetal red, and I've sort of rubbed the glaze off a little bit with a sponge before it was fired to expose the underlying oxide, which gives it that almost like a polished metal stud. Just a variation on the drum pots. Incidentally, the drum pots were really sort of based on the Japanese kodo drums, the taiko drums, and that's why they're called drum pots. And these were the studs that would hold the skins down on top of the drum. Just got the standard lozenge-shaped feet, and again, ideal for semi-cascade conifers. What I should say about this variation on the drum pot is that well, I did this several years ago, just purely, as I say, as a variation, because normally a drum pot would just have the single line of studs going around the upper part of the pot, which, as I said earlier, represents the studs that holds the skin down on the drum. Sometimes I would vary this, and I would just have the odd stud a bit lower or a bit higher, 2 or 3, as I went around. In other words, it was it lacked the symmetry. And the reason, my storyline behind this is that the little 5-year-old who was watching his grandfather potter making a drum pot thought he would have a go, and when he had his go and put the studs on, he didn't always get it right, so some of them were placed here, there, and everywhere. So that was just my little sort of BS thinking behind it. And then, as I say, occasionally you would get drum pots, which I have seen prior to my making this particular pot, with maybe 2 lines of studs, one above the other, and sometimes 3. But I've never seen one where the whole pot was covered. It's a square pot, which is not a particularly popular shape for bonsai. I'm not quite sure why, but very, very rarely do you see square pots. I did this one as a commission for somebody, I think it was in America, if I can remember, and it's very different in the way I've treated the pot. But basically, the actual construction of the pot was done in the usual sort of way. Roll out the clay for the base, then create your coils and work round. As you can see, I've got fairly severe edges on each corner, but then I've softened these by applying some mud painting, again, on the tops of opposite corners, and then on the bottoms of opposite corners. And these, again, were treated with an oxide to give you the various color variations that we've got. And we've used the white dolomite crackle glaze, which was inked to expose the crackle. And I've got some rather bizarre, fairly, how would I put it? Feet. These feet were very irregular shaped feet. I can't really describe it because it was purely and simply a one-off, made particularly for this pot because that's just how I felt about it at the time. Those little raised bits underneath the feet, the little white coloured things, those are felt pads, which I now put on the bottom of a lot of my pots before they leave. This is to stop them scratching, because unglazed feet, and the bottom of the feet obviously are unglazed, can be quite rough. And when you display bonsai on some of these highly polished display tables, they could easily get scratched. So I put these felt pads on just to protect the table more than anything. But yeah, it's these very formal pots are quite tricky to do when using the coil process. Coiling is easy when you're making a circular pot or indeed an oval pot, but for pots with severe angles on the corners, it's tricky. This is a semi-cascade pot shape, again because of its depth. So a nice semi-cascade flowering cherry or crabapple, any sort of flowering variety, or any deciduous tree. It's not really suitable for conifers. I think by now you've probably got the picture that conifers don't usually not usually potted into colourful glazed pots. They're the more somber, dull, earthy colours. Now, this is very much a departure from what I've been saying up until now, and this actually was a slab pot, not a coiled pot. I drew out on some card a template for the angles of the sides that I wanted, and I cut out 4 slabs, which I then attached using the traditional way of just scratching and applying water and merging the two together. I don't use slurries, but what I do use is a reinforcing coil on the inside of each corner. And as you can see, I've also got an inner rim on the upper part of the pot and also an outer rim. And I've got a beading on the bottom. As you can see and the manganese has come out and it's exposed itself, creating quite an interesting effect. The mud painting that I've applied to pots is not just any old random, just put it on and that's that. Each little daub of clay is visually considered for its aesthetic effect. I consider the actual size of the daub, and the position, and also, very importantly, the spaces in between. Like any artist would do when creating a painting, it is what I call mud painting. It's exactly that. It's not just a random effect. I have, on one occasion, had some very sort of sloppy wet clay, which I literally picked up bits of and threw against the pot. And in that case, you could get a fairly spontaneous result. But that wasn't the case here. And it's not a technique that I would strongly recommend because the clay that misses the pot can go all over the place. And you really don't have the same control. But yes, these mud painting pots of mine are highly considered paintings on the basic clay canvas. Again, when I do these sort of pots, I'm not really considering creating any particular effect. It's not supposed to be organic in the sense of being a plant, or a texture. It is purely its own thing, its own abstract design, but a highly considered one, and not just a happy accident. With this round coiled pot, again, no different in construction from other round coil pots that we've made. But what I've done here is I've done quite a strong um, effect on the surface of the pot using, again, my mud painting and also an upper beading. It's quite a heavy bead because this is actually quite a heavy pot. Again, as I mentioned earlier, with semi-cascade pots, you need that weight. You need the physical weight as well as the visual weight to actually stabilize the pot and prevent it from toppling over when you've got this sort of lopsided branch that comes out from a semi-cascade bonsai style. The feet are the usual extruded lozenge-shaped feet, and the glaze is my gunmetal red. I don't really think that there's much more I can say about this pot, other than the fact that it is a very powerful pot and was well received. These days, more and more of the pots that I make are commissions. I'm wondering whether this, in fact, has anything to do with the COVID problem that we're experiencing, because we don't have the shows that we used to have, where potters from all over the country would be selling their wares. So people haven't got access to those traders and are now having to work, commission directly potters to make pots for specific trees. I personally enjoy making pots for this purpose best, because it's nice when they supply you with a photograph of their tree, and then you've got to consider exactly what would best suit it. It's quite a challenging and also quite a creative opportunity to get something different, something that's going to work for yourself and also work for the person who's commissioned the pot. This pot is a very large pot. Again, it was a commission for a friend of mine. It was what I would call my racetrack. It's not the normal sort of oval shape. It is an oval pot, but not the normal oval shape, because it's got these parallel front and back sides, and then it's just the ends that are rounded. So it's very much like a cycle track or a race track or whatever. And again, it's treated with my mud painting. And what I've done here, as you can see, I've softened the roughness. I've done this with a palette knife. And I've just put it on the one side of the pot. So the person who had this pot has a choice of either a plain side or a textured side. In this particular case, this is the greenware. The pot hasn't been biscuit fired yet, nor has it been glazed. And of course, it will be glazed with the traditional gunmetal red. You know, as you can see from this round, I don't know how quite to describe this shape, but it's a bit like a velodrome. You know, you can see the cyclist belting round and round. Yeah, and this decoration on the side of the pot, like it's like a wind blowing leaves all over the place. Not meant to be anything particular, just a considered texture. One of my fun pots. I love doing these round, what I call primitive pots. In this particular case, it was just a fairly informal round pot. As you can see, I've left the surface of the upper rim untreated, smoothed it off a little bit, but I haven't trimmed it down in any way, completely distorted the form of the pot, and then done some fairly severe marks in the side, very spontaneous lines, just boom, boom, boom here and there, and lifted the pot and twisted it. And again with the gunmetal red, ideal for a literati style conifer pine or juniper. larch, anything like that, and these very, very informal feet. I really enjoy doing these pots. They are very spontaneous, but nevertheless, they're not as easy as they look, because every line has to relate against its opposites. So the front has to work with the back and the sides, and so it goes on. So I've seen many people attempt to do similar sort of things, but without this very, very intelligent thinking around the aesthetics of the pot, and the distortions that are introduced into it, you will not get an acceptable result. You'll get a result, but it can often be awful. In the usual way, this pot started off in the normal sort of way with coiling. Yes, but as I said, when I got to the top of the pot, I didn't level it off, as I often do. I just left the pot in a slightly irregular way, and but then further distorted the upper rim and the rest of the pot for that matter. Here I really have gone to town with this pot. Again, I love working on these freeform primitive pots. Again, made in the usual sort of way with my coils, round and round, and then quite severely bashed. Incidentally, I have put an outer rim on the top of the pot. Nothing special, just fairly clumsily applied, because the whole pot I want to have this very rugged effect. You can see I've left quite a bit of the actual original texture that results from merging the coils together. Particularly if you look on the right hand side, you can see the vertical lines where my finger and thumb have worked up and down to blend the coils. So I've kept this pot in this very sort of rugged way, a very powerful, strong little pot. Not a very big pot, probably just about 12 inches in diameter, but suitable for a number of different styles of conifer. What I should say about these informal primitive pots is that, in a sense, they're almost like the very, very early primitive pots made by native potters of eons of time ago, when the actual processes were all primitive, where pots were baked in fires and things like that. The clays were poor, and pots were distorted in their handling. You lift a pot and it slips and you get hand marks, and they were very accidental. And what one is doing, in a sense, here is, to some extent, trying to reconstruct some of these faults, as it were, that existed in some of these earlier pots made many millennia ago. So it's a bit naughty, really, when you think about it, creating a pot and then purposely destroying it, as it were. But then that destruction has to be done in a very, very, although it's very spontaneous, the movements I use to twist a rim or twist the base of the pot happens literally in seconds, but is nevertheless highly considered twist. And again, all of the lines have to work against each other. So that is the big challenge. That is where experience comes in. That's where confidence comes in. To do this sort of thing requires a lot of confidence. Once I make these pots in this sort of distorted way, which looks very easy, and indeed for me it is easy. Believe me, I don't think it's always as easy as it looks, and sometimes you do see examples where things have gone quite desperately wrong. But as I say, I've turned pottery upside down when I do these things. The traditional pots that you can buy from Japan that are imported are so um, straightforward in their designs and things. And I didn't want that, As far as I'm concerned, bonsai originated in China. It then migrated to Japan, and the Japanese developed it into the wonderful art form that we see and appreciate today. And they have their own pots and things. Well, for me, just as the bonsai trees are considered as works of art, I personally like to think that the pot also should be, can be, and should be a work of art. So I will treat each pot in my own way, and I will use the aesthetics of the West, and not necessarily apply the conformist approach that is so much the case in Japan. Unusual for me when making these distorted pots, these primitive pots as I call them, to have one that's glazed. But I thought I'd try it just for a change. And in this case, I've used a blue glaze. I'm not quite sure. I think I put it over a black ground, which I treated the pot with. But to be quite honest, I really can't quite remember. But as I say, it is unusual for me to glaze one of these pots in the usual sort of way with glaze, rather than the gunmetal red oxide glazes that I use. Well, can't say more than that. It's just a variation on the theme of primitive pots. Welcome to my Marmite pots. These Feyaki pots, as I call them, were based or inspired by a program that I saw of Igayaki pots. Iga being the village, yaki being ware, so Iga ware. And my Feyaki is Fey as in Fey land, ware, so Feyaki. I saw a program on the Japanese NHK television some years ago, and it was showing a Japanese potter creating some very spontaneous vase-like pots, which I hope to show you in a moment. But anyway, his pots were the Igayaki, Iga being the place, the town, the village, yaki being, I think, Japanese for ware, so it was Iga ware. So and his pots were all wood-fired, so the glazes on them resulted from the ash from the smoke of the wood fires falling on the pots during the firing process, resulting in some really delicious, really sophisticated, subtle glazes, which there was no way in this world that I could possibly emulate. So I thought, right, let's go the opposite. So, as you do, so I went and made these really violent colors instead as an alternative. And the whole pot is alive. It's twisting and turning and it's moving. It's anything but stable. I've put my ears on the top of the pot because that's what the Igayaki pots all had. But in this case, I've also got my tie-down feet on the pot. You really don't know when you apply glazes like this on the pot just what the outcome will be, because there must have been about 6 or 7 different glazes splashed on, blotched on, thrown on, poured on here and there on the pot to give the final result. Now, this sort of thing, this sort of pot would be used in a very selective way for certain flowering varieties. I've got crab apples in 1 or 2 of mine and quinces, and they work really well. You certainly wouldn't go putting a conifer in one of these pots, but they're fun pots, and I do enjoy them. I haven't made any recently. These were all done, this particular theme that I was working to when I did several. These were all done about a year or so ago after I'd seen the Japanese program. And as I say, just fun. I think they've probably lived the life. They've all gone. When I say gone to different homes. And be interesting to see what other people have planted in them. I hope people will send me photographs eventually. You heard me describe in the last pot the Feiyaki pot that I made, which was inspired by the Igayaki pots. Well, the pots that the guy who was making, the potter who was making them in the Igayaki kiln room was making pots very much more like vases of this sort of shape. And this one was a very heavily coiled pot that I made. And then I whacked it very severely here, there, and everywhere with a square section piece of timber to really cut in heavily into the sides. I also incised with a wooden tool, a sharp wooden tool, to get some of the lines. I applied my irregular ears here and there, and also the irregular rim. The pot was glazed with a white dolomite glaze, and I think I also had some copper here and there, but I didn't honestly know quite how it was going to come out. It's a crackle glaze. It's one of my favorite pots. I absolutely love it. You've got to see it in the flesh to appreciate it. You've got to hold it. You've got to feel it. As I say so often, to touch my feelings, feel my touch. And here it's all touch. It's all handle. The whole pot is a manipulation of, in the hands. And I just love it. It's so spontaneous. It's not a bonsai pot. It's a vase. This pot of mine, which is a very sort of irregular oval shape, has a slab base in the usual sort of way, but it's a bastard pot in a sense. It's an amalgamation of coils and also chunks of clay. I've put these chunks of clay in the front of the pot and then taken coils around the rest of the pot. Very, very rugged again in construction, ideal for literati style conifers, particularly ones that are fairly dramatic and have a lot of movement in the lines of the tree. Would be particularly well suited to this pot. The glaze is my gunmetal red. As you can see, I'm using this gunmetal red over and over again because it's just lovely. It has so many variations in it. As you can see, depending on the thickness of the oxides that I apply to get this effect, will determine, and also the glaze, because it's a combination of oxide and glaze, will determine whether it's just the red and gunmetal or whether you get this yellow coming through as well. And I haven't yet put the feet on this particular pot. I'm not quite sure why. I think I actually forgot. So there. Don't always get it right.
Okay, question. The bit that you put at the front there is going upwards like a top point of a triangle, which emulates the shape of a pine going in there. Is that a conscious thought?
The shapes of the bits in the front of the pot are purely and simply spontaneous manipulations of lumps of clay in my fingers that have been felt into that position. As I've said so often to people who come and visit when we're discussing pot and pot construction, it's not so much a case of my making the pot, it's more a case of my feeling the pot. I feel the pots into shape rather than to be overly exacting and overly precise about how this piece will go or how that piece will go. It's spontaneity in the finished design is vital as far as I'm concerned. It's the definition of all of my pots. They all have that free form effect, which, as I like to think, are art pieces in their own right. Just as the tree is an art piece in its right, as a bonsai, for me, the pot is an art piece as well.